June 1941. The air over Europe was thick and heavy, saturated with the smell of burning and triumph. The steel juggernaut of the German Wehrmacht, polished to a shine in the crucible of the Polish plains and French fields, turned eastward with the inexorable force of a tectonic shift. This was not just an army. It was a living, breathing idea roaring with steel, embodied by millions of highly trained soldiers, thousands of aircraft, and armored beasts that had redrawn the military map of the world with contemptuous ease. They were the gods of blitzkrieg, and their gospel was the thunder of tank treads and the scream of dive bombers. At the vanguard of this unstoppable force was the Panzerwaffe. The tank divisions, the elite of the elite, were armored knights of a new, technological age. Their commanders, young, sun-tanned, with a predatory glint in their eyes, looked east with a sense of superiority born only from a string of dizzying victories. Behind them lay a conquered Europe, fallen at their feet in a matter of weeks. France, with its vaunted army, had crumbled to dust. Britain was locked away on its island. Now, before them lay the final, largest target, the Soviet Union. And in their eyes, it was nothing more than a colossus with feet of clay. In taverns and officers' clubs, over maps, and in letters home, they laughed. They laughed at the propaganda stories of the Red Beast and at the clumsy, angular Soviet tanks they saw in intelligence reports. The T-34, a flimsy tin can their 37mm guns could punch through like cardboard. The high-speed BT tanks, parade toys lacking real armor and power. They, the German tankers, were professionals, artists of war. Their panzers, the Panzer III and Panzer IV, were the pinnacle of engineering. Precision optics from Zeiss, reliable radios, and perfect ergonomics, where every crew member knew his role, acting as a single coordinated machine. Their self-assurance was not empty bravado. It was based on facts, on experience, on the flawless logic of war as they knew it. They were convinced that the Asiatic hordes, led by illiterate commissars, could offer no resistance to their honed tactics of the wedge and kettle. In their minds, the Soviet soldier was just a faceless mass, and Soviet equipment a pile of obsolete metal. They were not just going to war, they were going on a safari, a grand hunt where entire armies and cities would be the trophies. At dawn on June 22nd, this Teutonic confidence took the form of thousands of artillery barrels spewing fire. The border erupted from horizon to horizon. Tank columns like steel serpents slithered down the dusty roads, crushing border posts and breaking through the first lines of defense. The first few days seemed only to confirm their wildest expectations. Everything was going according to plan. Soviet forces retreated in disarray, abandoning equipment and falling into gigantic encirclements. The German tankers met almost no serious resistance. Their guns easily dealt with everything in their path. Victory seemed not just close, it seemed inevitable. One more push, a few more weeks, and this colossus with feet of clay would collapse. They pushed their machines eastward, deeper and deeper into the vast, silent expanses. They crossed rivers, burned villages, and ground fields of ripe rye under their treads. The air trembled with heat, the roar of engines, and the scent of victory. They were the masters of this land, this war, this history. They did not know, and could not have known, that just over the next hill, in the dust and smoke of retreating armies, their next trophy was not what awaited them. A revelation awaited them. A revelation cast in rough, unfinished armor, one that would make them forget their arrogant laughter and learn a new, terrible word, a word that would become synonymous with their first true horror. Late June, 1941. Time itself seemed to congeal, turning into a thick, scorching mass heated by the sun and fires. The Wehrmacht's armored spearheads continued their relentless drive deep into Soviet territory, meeting no worthy resistance. In one such column, stretched along a dusty road somewhere near Grodno, rode Hauptmann Klaus von Mattern, a company commander in Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group. Like all his subordinates, he was filled with an intoxicating sense of superiority. His Panzer III, loyal and reliable, was not just a machine to him, but an extension of his will, a steel fist that crushed everything in its path. Suddenly, a crackling, agitated voice from the forward patrol came over the radio. "Attention! Enemy tanks sighted! Moving from the south!" Von Mattern smirked and pressed his eyes to the commander's cupola sights. On the horizon, raising clouds of dust, a dozen or so vehicles were indeed approaching. Their silhouettes were strange, unfamiliar. Low, squat, with unusually sloped contours, they looked nothing like the clumsy Soviet tanks they had been burning by the dozens. Another batch of scrap metal, the Hauptmann thought lazily, and gave the standard, well-rehearsed command over the radio. "Company, to battle. Target, tanks. Fire at will." His own gunner fired first. The 50mm shell, a glowing dot streaking through the air, struck the lead Russian machine in its frontal plate. Von Mattern expected to see a flash of an explosion, a plume of black smoke, the familiar sight of an enemy tank's death. Instead, he saw a shower of bright sparks and heard a deafening clang, like the toll of a bell, that carried even over the roar of his engine. The shell, failing to penetrate the armor, whined and ricocheted into the sky. The Hauptmann froze, unable to believe his eyes. "Again!" he roared into the throat mic. Another shot, and again, the same effect. A blinding flash and a shell bouncing off the sloped armor like a pea from a steel wall. Along his company's entire line, shots thundered, and all ended the same way, with humiliating, useless ricochets. And at that moment, the Russian tank, which until then had seemed just a strange target, came alive. It accelerated sharply to a speed that seemed incredible to von Mattern for such a machine. The long barrel of its gun swung smoothly and stopped, aiming at Lieutenant Schmidt's Panzer, positioned 100 meters to the right. A shot rang out, its sound deep and resonant, full of a primal power completely unlike the dry crack of the German guns. The Panzer's thin armor couldn't take it. The 76mm shell tore straight through it. For a moment, Schmidt's tank froze, and then a monstrous internal explosion ripped its turret from the hull, launching it several meters into the air. A cold, sticky sweat drenched von Mattern. His self-assurance evaporated, replaced by animalistic fear. His radio came alive, bursting with panicked screams. "They're hitting us from 1,000 meters. Our armor won't hold. Fall back." Another of his tanks became a blazing torch. The unknown Russian machines, using their advantage in speed and mobility, began to envelop his company from the flanks, conducting a methodical, cold-blooded execution. This wasn't a battle. It was a slaughter. The German tankers, the best in the world, the conquerors of Europe, suddenly felt like helpless cadets on a training ground. "Retreat! All units, retreat! Smoke screen!" von Mattern yelled, not quite believing he was giving such a disgraceful order. The surviving panzers began to pull back, reversing and firing, leaving the smoking husks of their comrades on the battlefield. The Russian tanks did not pursue. They stopped, like predators satisfied with their prey, and their angular, crude silhouettes against the backdrop of burning German machines looked like a death sentence. That evening, a pale Hauptmann von Mattern, his hands trembling, reported the incident to his colonel. He spoke of impenetrable sloped armor, a gun that cracked their tanks like nutshells, and incredible speed and maneuverability. The colonel, a gray-haired Prussian, did not let him finish. He slammed his palm on the table. "Nonsense, Hauptmann. You and your men gave in to panic. What miracle tanks? You encountered a few camouflaged anti-tank guns and abandoned the field. I'm ashamed of you." Von Mattern's report was marked as unreliable. the result of panic and combat shock. But it was too late. This first thunderclap had already sounded. All along the front, from the Baltics to Ukraine, similarly hysterical reports, full of horror and bewilderment, were flying from the headquarters of tank groups and divisions to Berlin. For the first time in the war, the German military machine had encountered something that did not fit into its calculations. Something had gone wrong. The name of that something was T-34. To understand the nature of the shock the Germans experienced, we must go back several years to the pre-storm silence of the late 1930s. We must travel to the industrial heart of the Soviet Union, to the city of Kharkiv. By day, it hummed with thousands of machines. By night, it was cloaked in shadows, concealing secrets within its factory walls that would shape the future of the world. It was here, in the design bureau of the Kharkiv locomotive factory, in an atmosphere of the strictest secrecy woven from fear and enthusiasm, that a tank destined to become a legend was born. Its father was a man named Mikhail Ilyich Koshkin. He did not look like a formidable master of metal. Quiet, reserved, with eyes that burned with the cold, unquenchable fire of obsession, he was more like a reclusive scholar than a creator of weapons. Koshkin didn't just invent a tank, he foresaw it. While military minds around the world wavered between extremes, creating either multi-turreted, clumsy land dreadnoughts or lightly armored, fast cavalry tanks, Koshkin saw a third way. He dreamed of a universal tank. He envisioned a machine that would combine the seemingly uncombinable, the speed of a light tank, the armor of a heavy one, and the firepower to destroy any opponent. This idea was heresy. It violated all established doctrines. The main armored directorate, GAB-TU, was run by stern, pragmatic military leaders, veterans of the Civil War. They demanded simple, reliable, and cheap machines. Koshkin's project, initially codenamed A-20, and its even more radical successor, the A-32, seemed to them a dangerous gamble. Sloped armor? Too complex to manufacture. A powerful diesel engine instead of the usual gasoline one? Unreliable and finicky. A long-barreled cannon? An unnecessary luxury. The bureaucratic machine, in all its rigid grandeur, tried to crush the audacious design, to force it into the Procrustean bed of outdated standards. Koshkin fought for his creation with the tenacity of a man possessed. He wrote reports, argued himself hoarse in meetings, and made his case, persuading and risking his career and freedom. In the end, he managed to force through the decision to build 2 prototypes. But even then, the battle was not won. The winter of 1940 was approaching, and the tank's fate still hung by a thread. It had to be shown to the country's top leadership in Moscow. But how could 2 secret machines, each worth its weight in gold, be delivered to the capital? And so Koshkin made a decision that was itself the stuff of legend. It was mad, desperate, and reckless. He decided to drive the tanks to Moscow on their own tracks, a 2,000-kilometer journey over winter wilderness roads. It was an unheard-of risk. The machines were still raw and untested. A breakdown on the way would mean the certain failure of the entire project. A breach of secrecy would mean a court-martial. But Koshkin gambled everything. He knew it was now or never. In early March of 1940, under the cover of a nighttime blizzard, 2 squat, angular tanks slipped out of the factory gates and vanished into the darkness. The legendary Kharkiv to Moscow run had begun. This was not merely a forced march. It was a pilgrimage to the altar of victory. Koshkin, already ill with pneumonia, rode in one of the machines. He slept in snatches, ate on the move, and personally took part in the repairs that were needed almost daily. The tanks broke down, got stuck in the snow, and fell through the ice on river crossings. Once, while saving a tank during a river crossing, Koshkin himself fell into the icy water. His illness worsened, but he refused to abandon the mission. On the 17th of March, filthy, covered in ice, but undefeated, the two tanks rolled onto Ivanovskaya Square in the Kremlin. They came to a stop before the country's top leadership, led by Stalin. For Koshkin, this was the moment of truth. The engines roared. The tanks, demonstrating an agility that was incredible for their weight, began performing aerobatic maneuvers right on the cobblestones, turning on a dime, sharp accelerations, and overcoming obstacles. The military leaders watched in astonishment. Stalin, as legend has it, walked around one of the machines for a long time, tapped the sloped armor with the mouthpiece of his pipe, and uttered a single phrase: "This will be the swallow of our armored forces." The tank's fate was sealed. It received its official name, T-34. An order was signed for its immediate mass production. Koshkin had won, but his victory demanded the ultimate sacrifice. The designer's health was completely shattered by that icy march. In September of 1940, just 6 months after his triumph, Mikhail Koshkin died. He would never see his steel child, his swallow, transform into the fearsome predator that would save his country. He gave his life so that his homeland would have a chance to survive. His tank was just beginning its journey. In heroic myths and on propaganda posters, the T-34 is portrayed as a flawless knight, born for victory. But the truth, as is often the case in war, was far more complex, mundane, and tragic. In the first months of the war, and for a long time after, the T-34 was less a beautiful swan and more of a true steel ugly duckling. It was a machine with enormous potential, but with an equally enormous number of teething problems that had to be cured with blood and sweat right on the battlefield. The euphoria from Stalin's decision and the successful test run quickly gave way to the harsh reality of production. To put such a revolutionary machine on the assembly line in such a short time was a titanic task. Kharkiv Factory Number 183 and the Stalingrad tractor plant, where production was launched, were overwhelmed. There was a shortage of quality steel, the machinery was not adapted for processing thick armor, and the workers lacked the necessary skills. As a result, the first series production T-34s that rolled off the assembly lines in 1940 and early 1941 were, in effect, one-off, crudely assembled products. The hulls were poorly welded, leaving gaps in the armor that let in not only rain and dust, but also lead spatter during shelling. The V2 engines, the tank's very heart, were capricious and unreliable. Their service life rarely exceeded 100 hours before requiring complex repairs or a complete replacement. But the biggest problem was the transmission. The gearbox was a true curse for the driver mechanics. Shifting gears required immense physical strength and skill. Often, the lever had to be struck with a sledgehammer, which was included as part of the tank's standard toolkit. In their very first battle, many inexperienced drivers would simply burn out the clutch or break the gearbox, turning a fearsome combat vehicle into a stationary target. But the main, almost scandalous flaw of the early T-34s was hidden in the turret. It was cramped, designed for only 2 crewmen. The tank commander was forced to simultaneously act as the gunner. He had to search for targets, assess the situation, give orders to the driver and loader, and at the same time, turn the hand wheels himself to aim the gun and fire. This was an impossible task, even for the most experienced tanker. As a result, the tank, despite its superior armament, often could not capitalize on its advantage. Added to this was the machine's terrifying blindness. The observation devices were primitive and of poor quality. A commander's cupola, which was standard on German tanks, was absent. The view from inside the tank was so poor that the crew often could not see what was happening just a few dozen meters away. The tankers felt trapped in a steel box, hurtling into the unknown. They navigated by sound, by the impact of shells on their armor, and by commands that came through the crackle of radio sets, if they even worked. And they rarely did. Most T-34s in 1941 were produced without radios, which made coordinating a unit in battle nearly impossible. The tanks operated blindly, one by one, and often became easy prey for the coordinated, radio-controlled German wolf packs. This is why, despite all its revolutionary advantages, the T-34's losses in the first months of the war were monstrous. For every single German tank knocked out, there were 5 or even 10 burned-out T-34s. The German tankers, having recovered from their initial shock, quickly learned how to fight this ugly duckling. They exploited its blindness, attacking from the flanks and rear, targeting the running gear and tracks to immobilize it, and then coolly finished it off with fire from several vehicles. The tankers who were assigned these first raw machines were, in essence, on a suicide mission. They had a love-hate relationship with their tank. They loved it for its power and for the fact that its armor often saved their lives where any other tank would have become a collective grave. And they hated it for its cramped conditions, its unreliability, the constant breakdowns, and the feeling of helplessness when you cannot see the enemy who is shooting at you. But it was they, these first crews, who paid with their blood for the transformation of the ugly duckling into a beautiful swan. They identified its flaws, devised new tactics, and forced designers and factory workers to make changes to the design. And in this tragic symbiosis of man and imperfect machine, the future victory was forged. So what was the secret of this plain, crude tank? Why did shells from the best German guns, which until then had pierced any armor, suddenly start bouncing off it like rubber balls? The answer was simple, like all strokes of genius, and it was called rationally sloped armor. This was not Koshkin's invention. The idea of sloped armor had been tested before, including by the Germans themselves on some of their vehicles. But it was Soviet designers who first dared to make this idea the foundation of a tank's entire protection concept. The physics of this phenomenon are simple. A shell striking armor that is placed at an angle must penetrate a much greater thickness than if it hits a vertical plate. For example, the T-34's upper frontal plate was only 45 millimeters thick, but it was installed at a 60-degree angle. Simple geometry tells us that for a shell traveling perpendicular to the tank's axis, this armor was equivalent to a vertical plate 90 millimeters thick. In 1941, no medium tank in the world had armor that thick, but that wasn't all. When a shell hit sloped armor at a certain angle, another, truly magical effect occurred: a ricochet. A sharp-nosed armor-piercing round, upon meeting an angled surface, wouldn't bite into it, but would instead glance off, losing its energy and veering away. The probability of a ricochet was higher the sharper the angle of impact. This was the very effect that German tankers and artillerymen observed with horror. Their shells, fired from long distances, would simply scream as they struck the T-34's front plate and fly off into the sky, leaving only a shallow scratch on the armor. It was like witchcraft. The Pak-36 anti-tank gun, the Wehrmacht's primary weapon for fighting tanks, which soldiers had nicknamed the door knocker for its helplessness, proved absolutely powerless against the T-34. It could not penetrate its frontal armor even at point-blank range. The standard guns on the German Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks were not much more effective. They could hit a T-34 in the side or rear, but to do so, they had to get dangerously close, exposing themselves to the blow of its powerful 76mm cannon. This magic of sloped armor also had another scandalous aspect. It completely devalued Germany's entire pre-war anti-tank doctrine. Billions of Reichsmarks spent on producing thousands of anti-tank guns and armor-piercing shells had been thrown to the wind. The army that considered itself the most technologically advanced in the world suddenly found itself unarmed in the face of a new adversary. This caused panic not only on the front lines, but also in the highest echelons of power in Berlin. Of course, this solution had its downsides. Sloped armor ate up precious internal volume, making the fighting compartment cramped and uncomfortable for the crew. It also complicated production and increased the machine's weight. But in the first, most terrible months of the war, these shortcomings were more than offset by one main advantage. The T-34 gave its crew a chance to survive, and a surviving crew is an experienced crew. It was this experience, multiplied by the machine's unique properties, that would ultimately turn the tide of the war. The T-34's sloped armor became more than just a technical solution. It became a philosophical answer to the German wager on quality and complexity. Soviet designers countered it with a brilliant simplicity that proved to be an order of magnitude more effective. They did not try to create an impenetrable wall. They forced the enemy's shells to work against themselves. And in this lay the true magic, which was beyond the grasp of Teutonic engineering genius. If the sloped armor was the T-34's soul, its invisible shield, then its heart was a diesel. And this was a decision no less revolutionary and fateful than its angled armor plates. In the 1930s, the entire world of tanks ran on gasoline. Gasoline engines were powerful, high-revving, and relatively light. This seemed to be an axiom that required no proof. But the Soviet designers, led by Koshkin, once again went against the current. They bet on diesel, and that bet changed everything. This was the legendary V2 engine, a 12-cylinder V-shaped monster originally developed for aircraft. It was the world's first specialized tank diesel engine of such power, 500 horsepower. For comparison, the Polish and Japanese tanks of that era, which were also equipped with diesels, produced just over 100 horsepower. Installing the V2 in a medium tank was a breakthrough comparable to the shift from sailing ships to steam power. The first and most obvious advantage was the fuel. Diesel fuel is much less volatile and flammable than gasoline. German tanks, with their gasoline engines, would burst into flames like matchsticks from any hit to the engine compartment or fuel tanks. The crews burned alive, turning their pristine panzers into steel coffins. In this respect, the T-34 was far more survivable. Of course, it also burned, but much less frequently. Diesel fuel did not explode. It simply burned, and the crew often had a few precious seconds to abandon a disabled vehicle. This factor, multiplied by thousands of tanks and hundreds of battles, saved the lives of tens of thousands of Soviet tankers. The second advantage was fuel economy. The diesel engine consumed significantly less fuel than a gasoline counterpart of the same power. This gave the T-34 a huge operational range, up to 300 or 400 kilometers on the highway. German tanks could travel 1.5 to 2 times less distance on a single tank of fuel. In practice, this meant that T-34s could conduct deep raids behind enemy lines, operate far from supply bases, and appear where they were least expected. Their mobility, combined with the vast expanses of the Eastern Front, became a real nightmare for the Germans. The T-34 was not just a tank, it was a ghost, a wolf of the steppes that could strike and then dissolve into the boundless space. But there was a third aspect, less obvious but perhaps the most important. The entire economy of the Soviet Union was geared towards the production of diesel fuel for its tractor fleet. The high-octane gasoline required for German tank engines was produced in much smaller quantities in the country. By betting on diesel, Koshkin did not just choose an engine type. He integrated his tank into the country's economic system, securing a reliable fuel supply for it. This was a brilliant strategic foresight that later allowed for the mass production of the T-34 and their uninterrupted fueling. Of course, this solution was not without its drawbacks. Like the rest of the tank, the V2 engine was raw. It required very high-quality oil and fuel, which were often unavailable. Starting it in the winter was an entire ordeal. The service life of the first engines was catastrophically short, only 100 to 150 hours. But all these problems paled in comparison to the colossal advantages that its diesel heart provided. By installing a diesel engine in the tank, Soviet designers created a machine perfectly suited to the conditions of the coming war on the Eastern Front. It was a tank for a large, relatively poor country with vast distances and less developed infrastructure. It was fire-resistant, economical, and ran on fuel that was available in abundance. The diesel heart of the T-34 beat in unison with the heart of the entire country, and it was this rhythm that ultimately drowned out the victorious march of the Teutonic gasoline engines. By the autumn of 1941, the arrogant laughter on the Eastern Front had finally fallen silent. The euphoria of the Blitzkrieg was replaced by a heavy, grueling advance where every kilometer was paid for in blood. And the main reason for this change was the T-34. Isolated reports about a miracle tank merged into a single, continuous stream of panicked reports that flooded Wehrmacht headquarters. The phenomenon became so widespread that a special term had to be invented for it: Panzer shock, or tank shock. This was not just combat shock. It was a deep psychological and ideological crisis. All of Nazi propaganda was built on the myth of the technological and racial superiority of the Aryan nation. The German soldier was raised with the absolute certainty that he, a representative of a master race, was fighting with the world's most advanced weapons against subhumans, Untermenschen, who were only capable of copying Western designs. And suddenly, this myth, the very foundation of their worldview, cracked and crumbled to dust. The subhumans had created a tank that was head and shoulders above anything in the Panzerwaffe's arsenal. One of the first to sound the alarm was the father of Germany's armored forces, Colonel General Heinz Guderian. After a battle near Matsensk in October of 1941, where the Wehrmacht's 4th Panzer Division was virtually annihilated by a brigade of Soviet T-34s under the command of Mikhail Katukov, Guderian wrote the following lines in his report to Berlin, which sounded like heresy. I reported in detail on the clear superiority of the Russian T-34 to our Panzer IV, and drew the necessary conclusions that must be urgently made for our future tank design. Its main advantages are its remarkable engine, its excellent armor, and its effective shape with sloped walls. This was unheard of. One of the Reich's top military commanders was openly admitting the superiority of enemy technology. He demanded that a special commission of designers and industrialists be sent to the front immediately to study the T-34 and copy it. But if the generals were in shock, the common soldiers and officers on the front line were experiencing true horror. For the crew of an anti-tank gun or a Panzer, an encounter with a T-34 turned into a deadly lottery with minimal chances of winning. They watched as their shells, fired from a kilometer away, bounced off the T-34's frontal armor. They watched as the Russian tank, paying no attention to their fire, rapidly closed the distance, its long-barreled gun searching for its next victim. At that moment, discipline and training gave way to primal fear. Artillery crews abandoned their guns and scattered. Tankers tried to awkwardly turn and flee, exposing their thin rear armor to a killing blow. Among the soldiers, the T-34 quickly became shrouded in myths. It was said that it was impossible to knock out, that its crews were made up of suicidal fanatics, and that it could appear from nowhere and vanish into thin air. This psychological breakdown was no less important than the physical losses. The will to win, based on a sense of superiority, began to evaporate. The reaction from the high command in Berlin was predictable. At first, there was anger and disbelief. Reports from the front were dismissed as fear-mongering and cowardice. But when losses began to be counted in the hundreds of tanks, and the advance slowed and finally ground to a halt at the gates of Moscow, the problem could no longer be ignored. Tank shock had transformed from a frontline problem into a strategic crisis. It was panzer shock that became the trigger for a new arms race. Hitler, enraged by the helplessness of his vaunted panzers, demanded that German industry immediately create weapons of vengeance. This is how the famous German Big Cats, the heavy Tiger tank and the medium Panther tank, were born. But that was another story. It was the story of a response, a reaction to the challenge thrown down by the plain, crudely welded, yet brilliantly simple Soviet T-34. Tank shock forced the Germans to learn to fight in a new way, and that lesson came at a very high price. But the Germans would not be Germans if they had allowed panic and superstition to triumph over pragmatism. After recovering from the initial shock, they began to dissect the new threat with the meticulousness of pathologists, searching for its weak points, its Achilles heel. Engineers, artillerymen, and tankers flocked like vultures to every captured, knocked out, or simply abandoned T-34. They measured it, tapped on it, photographed it, and compiled detailed reports and instructions. A total, army-wide hunt for the secret to the Russian monster's vulnerability had begun. And it was soon discovered that the steel giant, despite its magical armor, was far from immortal. The aces of anti-tank artillery were the first to find an antidote. Their despised 37mm door knockers were powerless against the frontal armor, but a lucky hit could jam the turret or damage a track. An immobilized T-34 transformed from a fearsome predator into a defenseless target that could be coolly dispatched from the side or rear. The more powerful 50mm PaK-38 guns could already penetrate the T-34's side armor from a distance of several hundred meters. The crews of these guns became true sniper hunters. They set up ambushes, camouflaging their guns so well they were invisible even from 50 paces. They would let the lead tanks pass and then hit the second or third vehicle in the side, causing confusion and a jam before methodically picking off the entire column. It was deadly dangerous work. A miss or an unlucky ricochet meant certain death under the tracks or from machine gun fire. But the real terror for the T-34 came from the air. The pilots of the Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers quickly realized that the tank's thin top armor on its hull and turret was vulnerable to their bombs. They would dive almost vertically onto the T-34s, releasing their deadly cargo from a minimal height. But the most terrifying threat came from the Henschel H's 129 attack aircraft, which were being fitted with powerful 30 and 37mm cannons. These flying can openers could attack the T-34 from above and behind, hitting its most vulnerable spots, the engine deck and rear armor. But the main hunters of the T-34 were, of course, their own kind, the German tankers. They couldn't compete with the T-34 in an open, head-to-head fight, so they turned tactics into an art. Using their main advantage, superb optics and radio communication, they operated like a coordinated wolf pack. One tank would create a distraction, drawing fire, while two others, exploiting the T-34's blindness, would move to its flank and hit its vulnerable side. They learned all its weak spots. They knew that the turret ring, the race on which it rotated, was one of the most vulnerable elements. A successful hit could jam the turret, depriving the tank of its main weapon. They aimed for the driver's hatch, trying to blind or wound him. They fired at the drive sprockets and idler wheels, trying to throw a track. It was a sophisticated, brutal hunt, where a knowledge of the victim's anatomy was more important than the caliber of the gun. The most coveted prize for the Germans was the development of sub-caliber ammunition. And here lay one of the most dramatic twists in this duel. German industry, working like clockwork, quickly established production of sub-caliber rounds with a tungsten core for their 50mm guns. This small, but very hard and fast projectile could now penetrate the T-34's frontal armor at short ranges. Meanwhile, Soviet industry, operating at its absolute limit, faced enormous problems producing such ammunition. The result was a paradoxical situation. German guns gained the ability to fight the T-34, while Soviet tankers often lacked the shells capable of penetrating the frontal armor of new German tank models. Thus, step by step, the Germans stripped the T-34 of its cloak of invulnerability. It ceased to be a mystical monster. It became just a very dangerous, strong, but mortal opponent, an opponent that could and must be defeated. The hunt for its Achilles heel turned into a daily bloody routine, and this hunt forced the Germans to finally understand. To defeat this beast, they needed a beast of their own, one even larger and with bigger fangs. Tank shock rolled through the Wehrmacht, reached Berlin, and struck the desk right in the Führer's headquarters. Adolf Hitler, who considered himself a genius of military strategy and a connoisseur of technology, was furious. He took the appearance of the T-34 not just as a military problem, but as a personal insult. The superiority of the Aryan race, embodied in steel, had been disgraced. The response had to be immediate, devastating, and final. He demanded that German industry create a tank killer, a monster that would surpass the T-34 in every way and restore the Panzerwaffe's lost dominance. Thus began the story of the birth of the famous German menagerie, the heavy Tiger tank and the medium Panther tank, according to German classification. Projects for heavy breakthrough tanks had been in development in Germany since the late 30s, but they were progressing sluggishly. Now, they were given the highest priority. Two firms, Henschel and Porsche, presented their prototypes. Ferdinand Porsche's design was innovative, with a futuristic electric-mechanical transmission, but it proved to be too complex, expensive, and required scarce copper. The more traditional and reliable Henschel design won. Thus, the Panzerkampfwagen 6 Tiger was born. This was a beast from a completely different weight class. Weighing almost 60 tons, it was encased in thick, vertical armor up to 100 millimeters. Its main argument was the legendary 88mm gun, which traced its lineage to the famous anti-aircraft cannon. This gun could penetrate the T-34's frontal armor from a distance of 1.5 or even 2 kilometers, a range at which the Tiger itself was completely invulnerable to the Soviet tank. In parallel, another, no less ambitious project was underway, codenamed Panther. This was a direct and undisguised answer to the T-34. German engineers, swallowing their pride, carefully studied the Soviet tank and tried to copy its best features, combining them with German technology. The Panther inherited the main feature from the T-34, sloped armor, which provided excellent shell resistance for a relatively low weight. But that is where the similarity ended. The Panther was a typically German machine, complex, high-tech, and very expensive. It received a new, long-barreled 75mm gun that even surpassed the Tiger's cannon in armor penetration. Its running gear, with an interleaved layout of road wheels, provided an incredibly smooth ride. The birth of these cats was agonizing. Hitler constantly interfered in the process, demanding the impossible and forcing changes to already approved designs. The industry was suffocating, trying to launch production of these complex and material-intensive machines in the shortest possible time. As a result, the first Tigers and Panthers thrown into battle were raw, suffering from numerous technical malfunctions and teething problems, in many ways repeating the fate of the early T-34s. The Tiger's debut took place in August of 1942 near Leningrad, and was a failure. The heavy, clumsy machines got stuck in the swamps and were easily destroyed by Soviet artillery. The Panther's baptism by fire at the Battle of Kursk in the summer of 1943 turned into a disaster. Of the 200 tanks sent into battle, the majority broke down due to technical faults before even reaching the front lines. But gradually, the Germans perfected their new machines, and when they did, the scales of tank warfare tipped in the other direction. Now, it was the Soviet tankers who experienced their own tank shock. A Tiger, operating from an ambush, could single-handedly destroy an entire company of T-34s while remaining unscathed. In a head-to-head duel, the Panther easily dealt with the T-34. It seemed that the Wehrmacht's counterstrike had achieved its goal. German technological genius had once again prevailed. But it was a Pyrrhic victory. The Tigers and Panthers were monstrously expensive and complex to produce and maintain. For every one Tiger built, Soviet industry, now working in the Urals, responded with 10 or even 20 T-34s. The German Cats were specialist, elite weapons, magnificent duelists. The T-34, however, was a mass-produced soldier's tank, a wave that simply swept away everything in its path. Germany had won the tactical battle of technology, but was beginning to lose the strategic war of economies. And Soviet designers still had their final word to say in this arms race. Summer 1943, the Battle of Kursk, the greatest tank battle in human history. This was not just a clash of two armies. It was a trial where the effectiveness of two industrial and design philosophies was put to the test. And while the Soviet side won that trial strategically, it paid a terrible price for the victory. The new German Tigers and Panthers clearly demonstrated that the era of the T-34's undisputed dominance was over. Their long-barreled guns were picking off T-34s from vast distances, while the Soviet tank's 76mm cannon was practically powerless against their frontal armor. The news from the front was like a thunderclap. The People's Commissar of the tank industry, Vyacheslav Malyshev, speaking at an emergency meeting, stated with bitterness, "Our tankers are fighting with the utmost courage, but German tanks are firing on ours from 1.5 kilometers away, while we can only hit their Tigers and Panthers head-on from 500 to 600 meters." It became obvious. The T-34 urgently needed a new, more powerful, long arm. The arms race entered a new, decisive phase. As early as January 1943, anticipating the arrival of German heavy tanks, the design bureaus under Vasily Grabin and Fyodor Petrov had begun work on a new 85mm gun based on a powerful anti-aircraft cannon. Now, this work was given the highest priority. Several prototypes were created in a very short time, and from them, the S-53 gun was ultimately chosen for installation on the T-34. But simply installing the new gun was impossible. It would not fit in the old, cramped two-man turret. A new, more spacious turret was required. And here, Soviet designers chose the path of unification, basing the new design on the turret from the new experimental T-43 tank. The new turret was a three-man design. This was the second improvement, no less important than the new gun. At last, the tank commander was freed from his duties as gunner. Now, he could focus on his primary job, observing the battlefield, searching for targets, and directing the actions of his crew. The turret now had a dedicated gunner. This seemingly simple solution vastly increased the tank's effectiveness in combat. And so, in January of 1944, the tank we all know and recognize, the T-34-85, was accepted into service with the Red Army. It was still the same good old T-34, with its reliable chassis, sloped armor, and diesel heart. But this was a tank that had been through fire and brimstone, had shed most of its teething problems, and had gained two decisive advantages: a powerful gun and a practical three-man turret. The new 85mm gun did not make the T-34-85 a tiger killer. It still could not reliably penetrate the heavy German tank's frontal armor from long range. But now, it could fight it on more equal terms. It could hit the Tiger in the side from a kilometer away, and with sub-caliber rounds, it could even penetrate the front from 500 to 600 meters. And against the Panther, which was its main adversary, it was more than effective. The duel had become a fair fight. The T-34-85 did not become a Wunderwaffe, a wonder weapon. It did not surpass the German tanks in every parameter. The Tiger was still better protected and armed. The Panther had better optics and a more accurate gun. But the T-34-85 was simpler, cheaper, more reliable, and most importantly, it was mass-produced. It became the ideal cruiser tank for the final stage of the war. It was the phoenix that rose from the ashes of Kursk to lead the steel armadas to Berlin. The arms race was won not by creating an absolute weapon, but by finding the perfect balance between combat effectiveness, manufacturability, and sheer numbers. From the beginning of 1944, a new picture, both mesmerizing and terrifying in its power, began to unfold on the Eastern Front. From the Ural factories, working in 3 shifts, trains rolled westward in a continuous stream, and on the flatbeds of these trains stood thousands of new T-34-85s. This was no longer the thin trickle of 1941. This was a deep steel river that, with each passing month, transformed into an unstoppable flood, ready to swamp the remnants of the Third Reich. The mass arrival of the new T-34s in the Army coincided with the refinement of new tactics for their use. The Soviet command placed its bet on deep, rapid offensive operations, with tank armies as the main striking force. The T-34-85, with its speed, operational range, and increased firepower, was the ideal instrument for such a war. It no longer chewed through the enemy's defenses, it flowed around them. Operation Bagration in the summer of 1944 became the triumph of this new strategy and the T-34-85's finest hour. Hundreds of these machines, gathered into armored fists, broke through the German defenses on narrow fronts and rushed deep into the operational space. They advanced 50 to 70 kilometers a day, avoiding prolonged battles. Their task was to sow chaos and panic in the enemy's rear, to cut communications, destroy headquarters, smash supply depots, and capture bridges and crossings. They moved without regard for their flanks, leaving encircled German garrisons behind them for the infantry to deal with later. For the German troops, this was a shock comparable to the tank shock of 1941, but in reverse. They expected a methodical, slow squeezing out from their positions, but instead, they received the blow of a steel spear to the heart. Their vaunted Tigers and Panthers were magnificent in defense, in ambushed tank duels, but they were completely unsuited for this rapid mobile warfare. Heavy, temperamental, and guzzling tons of fuel, they could not keep up with the T-34s, getting bogged down on muddy roads and breaking down on the march. Often, Soviet tankers, having broken out into the open, would find abandoned German cats standing on the roadside with empty fuel tanks or failed transmissions. The emotional symbol of this new war became the tank riders. Infantry rode into battle on the armor of the T-34, holding on to special handrails. This image, a tank covered with the figures of submachine gunners, hurtling down a dusty road toward the west, became the quintessence of the victorious offensive of 1944 and 45. It was a symbiosis of armor and man, a single striking organism that swept away everything in its path. The Vistula Oder, Pomeranian, and Berlin operations all followed this script. A steel flood, consisting of thousands of T-34-85s, rolled unstoppably westward. By the beginning of the Berlin operation, The tank brigades were almost 100% equipped with the new T-34s. This was no longer just an army. It was a force of nature. Of course, this path was not without its tragedies. In Hungary, near Lake Balaton in March of 1945, Soviet tankers faced the Wehrmacht's last major counterattack. Here, on a narrow sector of the front, the Germans had gathered their best SS Panzer divisions, equipped with King Tigers and Panthers. Fierce, bloody battles ensued, in which the T-34-85s once again had a hard time. But even here, the Soviet tankers held their ground. They won not with quality, but with quantity, tactics, courage, and self-sacrifice. They burned the elite German tanks from ambushes, rammed them, and destroyed them with grenades. They stopped this final convulsive blow of the Wehrmacht, ground down its best forces, and continued on their way. The steel flood reached Berlin. It poured into its streets, grinding down the last pockets of resistance. This flood, which had begun as a thin trickle in the Urals, had become a tsunami that washed the Third Reich from the face of the earth. And the main, most numerous, and most recognizable wave in that tsunami was the medium tank T-34-85. On the 9th of May, 1945, as the last shots echoed across Europe, the world stood still, trying to comprehend the price of victory and the scale of the destruction. Amid the smoking ruins of Berlin, on the dusty roads from Moscow to Prague, stood thousands of T-34s, battered, pierced, and burned, but victorious. The war was over, but the story of this tank was just beginning. It had already ceased to be just a machine. It had become a symbol, a monument cast in armor, a monument to resilience, self-sacrifice, and the brilliant simplicity that defeated complex Teutonic might. Why is the T-34, and not the mighty Tiger or the elegant Panther, considered by most experts to be the best tank of the Second World War? The answer lies not in technical specifications, not in armor thickness or gun caliber. The answer is in the word balance. The T-34 was not the best duelist, not the most protected fortress, and not the most accurate sniper, but it was the ideal, balanced soldier for a total war. It combined sufficient firepower, good protection, and superb mobility. But most importantly, it was manufacturable, cheap, and mass-produced. It was this mass production that became the deciding factor. During the war years, Soviet industry produced more than 65,000 T-34s of all modifications. The Germans managed to produce only about 6,000 Panthers and less than 1,500 Tigers. This was a war not only of designers, but of economies. And in this war, the Soviet planned system, capable of evacuating entire factories to the Urals and establishing assembly line production there, achieved an unconditional victory. The T-34 was not just a tank. It was a product of the entire nation, a symbol of its industrial power. It was also incredibly easy to repair. What would require factory-level service in a Tiger or a Panther was often fixed in a T-34 by the crew and a field maintenance team right on the spot, with a sledgehammer, a crowbar, and sheer brute force. Damaged tanks were quickly repaired and sent back into battle. This non-stop cycle of steel became another factor that ensured the Red Army's constant numerical superiority. After the war, the T-34's fame did not fade. It became the most widely used combat tank of the second half of the 20th century. It fought in Korea, where once again, as in 1941, it shocked the Americans. It saw combat in the Middle East, in Africa, in Vietnam, and in Yugoslavia. In some countries, it remains in service to this day, having transformed from a weapon into a piece of living history. But the greatest monument to this tank is not one made by human hands. It exists in our memory. The T-34 has become as much a symbol of victory as the red flag over the Reichstag. Thousands of these machines stand on pedestals in towns and villages throughout Eastern Europe, like eternal sentinels guarding the peace that was won at the cost of millions of lives. They have become ingrained in our culture, heroes of films, books, and video games. The history of the T-34 reflects, as if in a drop of water, the entire tragedy and greatness of that war. It began as an ugly duckling, raw and unreliable, thrown into battle unprepared. It went through the bitterness of the defeats of 1941, the hell of Stalingrad, and the fiery whirlwind of the Kursk salient. It rose from the ashes to become a powerful and refined weapon, and it swept across Europe as a steel flood, ending its combat journey in the enemy's lair. This is a story not so much about metal, but about people, about the genius of designer Mikhail Koshkin, who gave his life for his creation, about the millions of workers who forged the weapon of victory in inhuman conditions, and of course, about the hundreds of thousands of tankers who loved, hated, and conquered in this machine. They merged with it, becoming its heart and its mind. And when we look today at a T-34 frozen on its pedestal, we must remember that it is not just a tank. It is a monument to them, a monument cast in armor. Thank you for watching to the end. If you liked it, please give it a like, subscribe, and don't forget to hit the bell so you don't miss new videos. There are more amazing stories to come. Take care of yourselves and your loved ones.